Thanks so much for coming out. My name is Matt Evans. I'm one of the co-organisers of Bristol Skeptics in the Pub. We meet here once a month to hear a talk or a discussion about something related to science or philosophy, psychology, investigative journalism, things along those lines, and with the common theme being on some level critical thinking. So to give you an idea of some of the things coming up in November, something of a sequel to this talk, our committee member Henry will be talking about his experience going to a Steiner school and not being vaccinated as a result of that, and also being exposed to all kinds of funny beliefs, and then coming out of that and getting vaccinated as an adult. In January we'll have a talk on dementia. What's the science for dementia? Is there any hope? And in February we'll be having a talk on the paper industry and how some innovations in paper will be able to replace some plastic products, and how that can help with this plastics issue in the ocean. We'll also probably touch on recycling and perhaps some non-conventional aspects to or ways of looking at recycling, whether it might be counterproductive in some ways, and also probably touch on deforestation, things like that in that talk. We'll have a talk on astronomy in April. If you're wondering about October and March, they are mystery guests, soon to be revealed. How easy is it to be a skeptic and think critically and rationally about claims? Well, in my case it was fairly easy because, for example, it's quite easy for me to think there's probably no ghosts because I'm not a professional ghostbuster. I don't have to rely on that belief for my income. And if you're really neck deep in a belief where all your family and friends and community and so on rely on a certain strange or unusual belief, then it can be really difficult to step outside of that. So that's why I'm really impressed with Izzy Posen, our speaker today, and his story. And we'll get straight into that, but first perhaps we can thank Izzy for showing up. So we'll do this interview style, which is why I'm here up on the stage. So Izzy, perhaps you can start by telling us what's the difference between Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, and Hasidic Judaism. It's quite confusing for a lot of us.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thanks for having me, Matt, and thanks for coming to hear my story. It's very humbling to be here, especially given that most people here are the age of my parents and not my age.
I am your parent.
I do think of myself as a skeptic, although sometimes I'm skeptical of whether I'm a skeptic. But I think ultimately, if you don't have moments where you're skeptical of your skepticism, are you even a skeptic to begin with? Okay, so I grew up in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in East London and Hackney. Now, with the titles, it can be very confusing, so let me just clarify some terminology before we get started, and I'll tell my story. Judaism is, how far back should I go? God created the earth 6,000 years ago. So Judaism emerges in the Near East around in the first millennium BCE. It's more of a tribal religion. It's not really what we would think of nowadays as a religion. It's more of a culture. It has a king. It's not clear to what extent they were even religious. They worship lots of idols, blah, 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 blah. Temple gets destroyed in 70 AD. Jews are exiled from Israel, and we start seeing a religion forming. Because they no longer have the king, they no longer have the temple, so the way they consolidate their identity is with religion and God. Fast forward 1.5 millennia, and the beginning of the 18th century, there's enlightenment in Europe. Most Jews live in Europe, and enlightenment brings in secularism, and there's emancipation. For the first time, Jews are told they can come out of the ghettos, they can go to university. and they start to grapple with how to make sense of the ancient faith that is steeped in superstition and lots of very funny rules, and I'll give some examples of that later. And they want to make sense of that. So two schools of thought emerge. There's the kind of Enlightenment reform school of thought that says, you know what, it's a modern world, we no longer have to stick to these strict rules, we can be Jews without being so superstitious, and it becomes this turns into more or less, you know, secular Jews, reform Jews, and most Jews nowadays, this may sound surprising, most Jews are not religious. So you may have all heard that Jews don't eat pork. In fact, most Jews do eat pork because most Jews are not religious. The other school of thought that develops is Orthodoxy. So Orthodoxy says, well, as a response to the secularization of the outside world, we have to strengthen our faith even more. And within Orthodoxy, there are again two schools of thought, and this is where I come to distinction: Orthodoxy and ultra-Orthodoxy, and I'll hopefully get to the point. So the broad Orthodoxy said, yes, it's a modern world, yes, we've got to incorporate all of modern ways of thinking, engaging with the arts and sciences, but we can keep our faith as well. This develops into what some call modern Orthodoxy, or just Orthodoxy. And then there's ultra-Orthodoxy, which says, look, the Enlightenment has brought a decrease in religious observance, it's brought a secularization. The only way we're going to tackle it is by rejecting it completely. So they reject the sciences, they reject the arts. They're basically saying, we want to stay in the ghetto. We don't want emancipation. And that school of thought gets even strengthened through the Holocaust, and eventually end up with the community I grew up in. There's around, just to give you some idea of how it works worldwide, there are communities, ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities in Israel, New York, London, Manchester, small group in Antwerp, and then that's pretty much it. There's a little bit, smaller groups in other parts of the world, a little bit in Canada. So there's not many of us, maybe 1 million of us worldwide. But we grew up with a very interesting theology that made sense of Jewish suffering, that made sense of everything around us, but saying that we are very special. We are God's, the only remaining kind of faithful to God on earth. So the whole world has gone astray, and we are, you know, God's eyes are solely on us, but we are the only thing that matters. And even other Jews, so this is beyond the belief that Jews are the chosen people, because this is saying that even most Jews have gone astray. So we had a very superior belief on the one hand, but also very isolationist belief on the other, where we have to stick to ourselves, not engage much with the outside world, because the outside world has gone corrupt, and we have to resist any infiltration of influence from the outside world. Do you want to ask me another question, or should I go on?
Go ahead.
So how did this manifest? So maybe quick raise of hands. If anyone has seen kind of an ultra-Orthodox Jew, would be able to identify one. Okay, so some, not many. I assume if you live in London, you probably have seen them. They usually keep to themselves. The way you can identify them, and the way I dress, is the men will usually dress fully in black, so black hats, black coats, long beards and side locks, and the women will either cover their hair or wear a wig, and dress extremely modestly. So legs will be covered, long skirts beneath the knee, long sleeves, and so on. So it's quite easy to identify them. Usually women walk on the streets with a double buggy and 3 kids hanging along. So we grew up in London physically, and our neighbours were non-Jewish. We saw non-Jews all the time, but spiritually and socially we were isolated. We believed that we mustn't associate with others. So, for example, we didn't speak English. We didn't speak the country's language. We spoke Yiddish, and I'll come on to talk more about that and how I learned English soon. Why did we speak a different language, Yiddish? Because we believed that we need to stick to each other, to ourselves, and you don't need to know English, because English is just going to help you communicate with outsiders, which you don't need anyway. We didn't have any access to any media. So TV was strictly forbidden, radio, secular newspapers, the internet was strictly forbidden, is strictly forbidden. This community still exists. I've left it, but it still exists. And we had our own education system. None of us went to public schools or either to other Jewish schools. We had our own ultra-Orthodox schools. And of course it was strictly segregated on the basis of sex. And boys and girls are raised very differently in the community. I mostly tell the story from a boy's perspective because I did grow up a boy. But I will add some details about girls as well. So the community's ideology, and this is based on ancient superstitions, is that men are cleverer than women. Therefore, men's role is to study God's law and to have an intellectual connection with God through studying God's law. What is God's law? God's law is the Bible, but then the Talmud. So by the Bible, I mean the Hebrew Bible. The first, we don't do the New Testament. As I said, we reject modernity. But the Hebrew Bible is very obscure, as anyone who tried to read it has noticed. And spoiler, it's obscure because it wasn't given by an all-powerful God. It was written by humans who weren't great at writing. So the Talmud comes along 1,000 years after it was written and interprets it and develops Jewish law, and it's very, very extensive. The Talmud has 24 volumes, and boys are brought up to study the Talmud pretty much all day long, at least until you're married at the age of 18, which I'll talk about later. You're expected to study, if you're a boy, you're expected to spend all day long studying the Talmud, and that's the way you get a connection with God. Girls, on the other hand, not only are not expected to learn the Talmud because they're not clever enough, they're not allowed to learn the Talmud. Why are they not allowed to learn the Talmud? Because the Talmud says that women, because they don't have the intellect, will take Talmudic passages out of context and will pervert it. So they're to be kept away. And this is a great control mechanism because women are automatically subjugated to the men that way, because for every religious ruling that they need, and they need it because it's a religious life, they have to ask the men. So girls are brought up very differently. They don't study the Torah, they don't study the Talmud, they do study secular education, which the boys don't. So ironically, this extreme sexism means that girls get a far better education than boys. Because we as boys didn't study any secular education. I went to a school that was illegal, and we didn't even study the ABC, nothing. Most of my classmates wouldn't recognize the ABC. Whereas my sisters went to schools where they did study English and so on. Right, at this point I'll let you... I want to make one clarification before we go on. The ultra-Orthodox Jewish community is not a homogeneous community. There are different sects within the community. Every community will have its slight different interpretation. In fact, every subsect believes that the other sect is heretical and doesn't talk with them and doesn't marry them and so on. So I don't want, you might go away from this event and then you'll meet somebody who said they also grew up ultra-Orthodox Jewish and they'll have a slightly different experience. I just want to stress that this is my experience from the specific sect I grew up in within the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. If you do want, for academic purposes, if you do want clarification on the exact details of the name of the sect and how other sects might do it differently, I'm very happy to give it. But I feel like it will ruin the flow of the talk if I just at every point start giving technical footnotes. I hope that's fine.
So Izzy, I'm curious to hear a bit more elaboration on what the school life was like. So I've got 6-year-old twins. They just started going to, they're in year 2 of primary. What age were you when you went to school, and do you learn to read and write Yiddish at first, and then at what age? Because you can't study the Talmud when you're 6, presumably, and then at what point does it become Talmud all day, sort of thing?
So in the school that I went to, my own journey is slightly different to how it would be for a typical child, because I didn't grow up in London for the first 7 years of my life. I grew up in a different community. It's called Gateshead, next to Newcastle, where there's a sizable ultra-Orthodox Jewish community as well. But that's slightly different. They're not as extreme. So I did grow up the first 7 years of my life I did speak English in primary school, and I did learn to read and write English until I was 7. When I was 7, we moved to London, and that's when I started going into this more extreme community. So a typical day in the more extreme school, you start teaching kids to read and write like in all other schools, but they learn to read and write Yiddish. And then slowly you start. They get introduced to the Hebrew Bible, and then the Talmud eventually. Now the Hebrew Bible is written in Hebrew, as the name would suggest, and the Talmud is written in Aramaic. And you'd expect either of two things. You'd expect that if you're going to study that text, you're either going to have it translated into Yiddish, the language that you speak, or you're first going to learn Hebrew before you start learning it. But that's not the way we were taught. We were taught these texts. So we were taught the text by root, and I gather in Muslim communities it's the same, where they don't necessarily need to understand Arabic, they just need to be able to repeat the Quran in its original Arabic. So that's how we learned the Hebrew Bible. We were taught to repeat the words, and we were taught the translation whilst we learned it, and eventually we did pick up Hebrew and Aramaic as well, but we didn't learn it methodically. So so what would a typical day look like? We'd start 8, 9, we'd have prayer, which takes around an hour, morning prayer. Then we'd spend the day studying various kinds of Jewish texts, whether it's the Bible, the Talmud, Jewish law. And I want to say another thing that's different in these schools from other schools is that they still use corporal punishment. And this is based on a biblical verse in Proverbs that says, roughly translated, withhold the rod from your son and you hate your son, meaning that if you truly love your son, you're going to beat the shit out of him to make him behave. And they followed this. For this verse, they didn't need any Talmudic interpretations. It was pretty clear what to do. So we were hit a lot with all kinds of instruments, spoons, sticks, rulers. Bare hands, on the cheeks, on the bum, on the fingers, and I was hit particularly a lot because I was a questioning child, and I like to misbehave. I still do. We also they don't value, in a secular school, and by secular I don't mean non-religious, I mean in a school in the outside British society, they would value things like development and creativity. Kids would be working on group projects together to develop their sense of cooperation with each other. They'll be taken on educational trips to museums and so on. None of that. We didn't have any of that. It was just studying text because they didn't value those kinds of things.
And if you didn't have a TV, presumably no sort of comic books or children's books, no media, what was playtime like? I mean, after school, what passed for fun?
Right, so I grew up in a house with 10 kids in it, so there was never a shortage of people to fight with or play with. I did read a lot growing up. We had Yiddish books published within the community, which mostly focused on stories of sages. And there's a big literature in my community. It's a very superstitious community, as I said. They believe that righteous people can do miracles and can know the future. And there's a whole genre of literature, hundreds upon hundreds of books of retellings of these miracles. And growing up, I was really obsessed with these stories. I'd read about all these righteous people and sages who performed all kinds of miracles. Usually the theme of the miracle will be something as follows. So there's this Jewish Jewish serf in 18th century Europe, subjugated by this evil duke or landowner or whatever the technical word is. What is the technical word?
Lord, perhaps? I don't know.
Like a feudal lord or something.
Feudal lord, and the feudal lord is raising the taxes, and he can't do it anymore, and he can't feed his children. So he comes to the sage, and the sage says, "Oh, don't worry, go home, everything will be fine." He comes home, and the lord is dead. And this is 50% of the stories of that nature, just told in the name of different sages. Anyway, so we would. I did read a lot, but it was just a different kind of literature.
Okay. And one thing I was quite surprised when I heard you read you some comments that you've made before is that you were told a quite Christian-sounding version of hell was awaiting you if you didn't follow the rules. Is that right? I found that quite surprising because specifically the version of hell, as I recall you saying.
Yeah. So if you ask any more modern Jew, they'll tell you hell doesn't exist in Judaism, and they'd be right in the sense that the Jewish reformers of the 18th and 19th century very cleverly excised it. So they said we don't do it, and it's a clever thing. I think it's a good thing. Nobody needs hell in their life, but we did grow up with hell. Hell is heavily mentioned in the Talmud, and it was a very literal hell for us. So if you sin, God, you will end up after you die. We punish every sin. You get X amount of lashes or X number of minutes in hellfire, and if you do good on the converse, you get time in heaven. And we grew up with that in a very literal sense, and I assume some of you who may have grown up Christian understand what that's like.
Did that cause you or any of your friends like nightmares, or did you feel like that was quite distressing? Getting this at a very young age as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I absolutely believed in it. We absolutely believed in it. It was very real. We felt it, and it was frightening. We did have, but I guess Christians have, maybe it depends on the denomination, but if you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, then I guess you can avoid the hellfires, right? We had something different. We had once a year, there's something called Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and if you fast and you atone well, then you can also atone for your sins. So we did take that, and it's actually it's this time of year. Yom Kippur is in, I think, 1 or 2 weeks' time. So that did help us, but we took it very, very seriously.
And so at some point, as I understand it, you go to yeshiva. Is it yeshiva? Is that like a secondary school, or is that more like university or college? What age is that?
Right, so until the age of 13, you're in what's called cheder. It's a Yiddish word for primary school. When you're 13, you go to yeshiva. You're, according to Jewish law, you're an adult when you're 13. And you start assuming, that's when you start wearing the black dress, and you start, even your days become even longer. You start studying from 8 in the morning until sometimes 10 in the evening. Yes, I went to yeshiva when I was 13. There's first yeshiva katana, which means small yeshiva, young yeshiva, so it's like, I guess the equivalent of high school. And then when you're 16, you go to yeshiva gedola, which is like sixth form, I guess, which is another 2 or 3 years also in yeshiva, but it gets kind of more intense. When I was 18, I left London and I went back to Gateshead up north. It's like going to university, but I went to school Gateshead Talmudical College, so it's a yeshiva where we also study the Talmud all day long, and that's where I guess you'll ask me about that.
This is and it's also a boarding school, right? You're sort of staying there.
Yeah.
So is it still quite controlling at that point, even though you're older and theoretically becoming more independent, but it's still quite controlled, I assume?
So once I left home to go to yeshiva, I had much more freedom, de facto freedom, because for the first time, I could just slip out and go places and people wouldn't know. I was away from my parents, away from my community. Another thing, as I said before, the Gateshead community, which is also ultra-Orthodox, is far more relaxed than the community I grew up in. So I was there and I could have more freedom, and I met for the first time people, well, for the first time since I was 7, people who spoke English as their native language, even though they were ultra-Orthodox. And just to clarify, not all ultra-Orthodox Jews speak Yiddish only. It was my community, my sect, who spoke Yiddish only. So there I met people who spoke English, and I started associating with them, exchange ideas. I found out things that I didn't know about. For example, I found out that I mean, I must have known about movies before that, but for the first time I was speaking with someone who told me they've watched a movie, you know, they know what it's like. And before that, I never... it wasn't on my radar that movies were a thing. A friend of mine told me about evolution. It was in the context of debunking it. He's like, oh, these Goyim, these Gentiles, they have this crazy theory. And it's, of course, nonsense. Like, tell me more. So I started discovering stuff. I also started to go to the library and take out books.
Did that have to be done sort of undercover? Was that frowned upon to go to the library?
Yeah, very much so. No, it was still completely forbidden, and especially given the community I came from, I had friends who came with me to that yeshiva from the community, and we all looked out on each other. So they couldn't see me go to the library. So I did have to sneak into the library. I went in the early morning when they would be praying. I would go, and you know, this is where my long coat came in handy because I could hide the books underneath them.
And as I understand it, a key moment came when someone gave you their old phone, their old smartphone, internet-connected phone. Is that right?
Right. So the expectation is, given the more extreme community I come from, the expectation is that even though you go to Gateshead, which is a more liberal community, you're still gonna hang out with your more extreme friends. And just so I don't say extreme and liberal over and over again, the name of my community was Hasidic, so it's a subgroup of the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, and the Gateshead community was non-Hasidic, slightly more open-minded, and we were expected to, you know, we're boarding there, but we're expected to have only Hasidic roommates, so we don't get influenced from our non-Hasidic roommates. So keep in mind, even though they're ultra-Orthodox and we're comfortable enough to go to their college, we still thought that they can have bad influences on us, and as it turns out, they did on me. But the reason, so I specifically picked non-Hasidic roommates because I was learning English at that time, and I wanted to be in an environment where I'm forced to speak English and practice. So I picked non-Hasidic roommates, and that was very frowned upon. I got a very bad rep from my Hasidic friends for that, to the point where, and I'll talk about kind of the matchmaking process in a moment, but the point where my parents were worried that I'm not going to be able to find a match because my roommates are non-Hasidic. So in that room, one of my roommates had an iPhone hidden, which is proper contraband, proper haram. Like if you're caught with an iPhone in yeshiva, you're immediately kicked out, immediate effect. So he had one hidden in yeshiva. He was a big football fan, and he just used it to get updates. And when he got an upgrade, he gave me his old phone, and that was the first time in my life. This was in the spring of 2015. It was the first time in my life where I accessed the internet. And you know, until that point, I haven't talked much yet about my intellectual journey, my skeptical thinking. But until that point, I was having my doubts. I was thinking, I was questioning, but I didn't have any access to, you know, skeptical books or atheist books or anywhere where I can consolidate kind of my doubts and see that you know, there are other people asking these same questions. I was made to feel by my teachers that I'm the only one who has these crazy ideas, that maybe the Bible wasn't written by God. You know, nobody thinks that, and it's easy to believe when you're in an environment and everyone you know is just happy to go along with it. It makes you ask, am I crazy or what, right? But once I went online, it didn't take more than a quick Google, and I found these skeptical websites and all those kinds of arguments, and within no time I actually found myself in a situation where I saw that actually most kind of critical thinking people don't believe in what I was made to believe. So it didn't take lots of time until my faith was completely lost.
And then, as I understand it, you then decided you had to sin. You said, I've got to consolidate this by sinning to kind of sort of confirm my new identity. Is that right?
Right. So I kind of lost my faith early summer of 2015, where I kept a journal. I still have a diary where I just kept tabs on where I am belief-wise and kind of all the arguments for why I should believe, I shouldn't believe, what I should do. And keep in mind, it's a very scary thought, discovering that, you know, the idea you've devoted your life to and is might not be true. And not only that, there is no future for you in your community if you don't believe. Everything is centered centered around belief. Literally every minute of your day is dictated by the religious laws, literally, and you pray 3 times a day, and there really isn't, like, if you're not a believer, even if you keep it secretly, even if you're in the closet, there is really no meaning for your life in that community. So it was a very scary thought, but I had kind of come to the conclusion that I don't really believe early summer 2015, but I didn't know what to do with it. I still didn't know anyone outside of the community. I was still struggling with my English. I didn't have any money of my own. I really didn't know what to do with that. So I stayed in yeshiva for another 2 or 3 months, and still completely practicing. I didn't, it's one thing to lose your faith intellectually. It's a completely different thing to do things that all your life you believed are sins. So in this time, I started through the internet. I started making connections outside with people who have already left. I didn't find anyone in the UK who left, so I made contacts with people. Anyway, so I was starting to get a foothold outside the community. I was starting to explore avenues of what I would do if I leave, and what support might be available for me. But I was still completely practicing, so it came to a point where I was having huge cognitive dissonance, and I realized that I have to do something drastic to kind of stop practicing, because I could just go on like this. So I just decided that I'm just gonna do as many sins as I can in 1 week, to kind of beat this irrational fear out of me. So Jews are not allowed to eat milk and meat, so I would just eat a meaty dinner and then gulp down a cup of milk quickly when the meat is still in my mouth. I discovered masturbation in that week. It may sound surprising and people might not believe it, but I never masturbated until I was 20 years old. Never. Masturbation is one of the biggest sins in my community. As bad as eating pork, as bad as we were really sexually suppressed, and over and over again we were told that thinking about women and thinking about these kinds of thoughts are strictly forbidden and they're the worst, and I was really frightened off by those, so I never tried. So that week I kind of discovered that, and I also ate my first non-kosher food. So I went and bought a ham sandwich and ate it, it wasn't great. It was pretty disgusting, but it kind of again consolidated this feeling that I'm not bound by these rules anymore. The rules exist, but I don't believe in them, and I'm not bound by them anymore.
And at some point your teachers and mentor catch on to this and stage a sort of dramatic intervention. Is that right?
Right. So throughout this whole process of my kind of journey of thought in yeshiva, I was in touch with one of my teachers who I trusted, and he was aware of my doubts. He tried to help me. He lent me books that he had on arguments for why God does exist and why it is all true, and I read all the books. I would always come back to him and say I'm not convinced and here's why. I would have chats, but he wasn't, as long as it was theoretical, intellectual for me, he wasn't as concerned. He was like, okay, it's a teenager going through a phase, you're questioning a little, you soon feel more relaxed and you stop questioning. But during this week I come up to him and I said, that I'm no longer religious. He's like, what do you mean? You have doubts, right? I'm like, yeah, also, but I no longer practice. Like, what do you mean? Like, you would eat pork? I'm like, yeah, I've just had sandwich. So he immediately, this is an emergency. This is like the concept of losing a Jewish soul. In fact, the community treats somebody dying as less bad than somebody being non-religious, because if you're dead, only your body is dead, but your soul is still alive. But if you're non-religious, then your soul is dead, which is worse. So he I don't know what he did, but within a day or two, he had tickets for me to fly to Israel, and he had a whole program organized for me where I was going to meet these outreach, proselytizing professionals who were going to take me around to rabbis in Israel, and each is going to present me their arguments, and I'm going to be convinced that it's all true. So I agreed to go on this trip. I went, and they assigned to me a mentor, one individual who was going to take me around, and he did. I spent for 6 weeks in Israel, and I met a dozen of rabbis. Some were nicer than others. Some just tried to give arguments, and I disagreed with them, and I told them why I disagree with them. Some were more nasty and used more manipulative tactics. One rabbi tried to convince me that I had a psychiatric illness because nobody in the right mind questions, and he actually sent me to a psychiatrist to have me tested. And the psychiatrist, just after the assessment, just told this rabbi, I know you don't like that he has doubts, but he's healthy, so engage with his doubts. But anyway, after 6 weeks in Israel, by this time I was in touch with an organization back in the UK called Mavar. Mavar means transition in Hebrew. They're an organization that is set up specifically to help people like myself to transition into the secular world. And by this time it was nearing September 2015. And they advised me that if I want to go to university, I have to start catching up on the secular education that I missed. So I'll need to do GCSEs. And September was coming and the academic year was starting. So I was desperate to come back. And also I'd spent there 6 weeks and I still wasn't convinced. So I spoke with my dad and I told my dad, look, I've tried, I really did try, I listened to all the arguments, I read numerous books, I haven't been convinced. What now? Just, accept it. And my dad said, no, you're staying in Israel until you're religious. So I said, no, I'm really not, I'm coming home now. So he said, well, you can come back to London, you're not coming home. And that's the last time I spoke with him for 6 months. And it's the last time I spoke with most of my siblings and most of my friends. So at that point when I decided that, I've made up my mind, I'm coming back as a non-religious person, that was when I got cut off completely. So I did come home to London. I wasn't allowed home. I was essentially homeless. I had all that I had was literally the white shirt and black coat that I owned. So this Mavar organization arranged for me, they arranged a really lovely couple who just had a spare room, who took me in free of charge. I didn't have money. They gave me their son's old clothes that I started wearing, and eventually I started kind of incorporating slowly, gradually I started kind of getting into society. So I found a job, initially started earning money so I could hire a place. I rolled into college and started meeting non-Jews there, and eventually through a slow process, through many years, meeting lots of people, I kind of started to feel like I can be part of secular wider society, and by now I do feel like it's 4 years later, I do feel like I fit in completely, unless you come across as otherwise.
So we're just going to do 5 more minutes before the break, and then we'll do Q&A and perhaps come back to your personal story more in the Q&A. But before then, I just wondered if you could elaborate a bit more on how this community works, because it sounds very bizarre. People aren't being educated, so presumably they don't really have good jobs, and they can't interact with any of the bad people who are not from the community. So how do they buy things and go to shops, and what happens when they go to the doctor? Do they accept medicine and so on? Could you elaborate a bit more on how that sort of thing works?
Sure. But before I start answering that question, I just want to say that all the anti-Semites should please leave the room. I don't want to feel always when I talk about this, I'm very conscious about the fact that there's always going to be an anti-Semite who's going to be listening to this. I'm going to be very happy that here's a guy exposing the less glamorous parts about Jews, and I don't want to do that. I'm still a proud Jew. I want to make that clear. And most Jews actually condemn this kind of behavior and feel that it's awful. This is a specific. It's like when we condemn Islamist extremists, but we wouldn't say that all Muslims are like that. I just want it to be clear. Yeah. Well, now that the anti-Semites have left, So the community, again, it's all based on the theology of superiority and exclusiveness. So the community does believe that they are the true kind of allies of God on this earth, and the rest of the world has gone corrupt. So they're very comfortable with the idea that the rest of the world should work for them. And in fact, they believe we were taught, why are there so many non-Jews in the world? Why do they exist? Well, they exist to serve us. So we serve God, and they serve us. So how do they serve us? They serve us by building our technology, by making washing machines for us, making buggies, and in the case of Britain, paying taxes so that we can exploit the system and get benefits. And this is a large part of this is a large part of how the community functions. There's lots of poverty in there. Well, some people do earn an honest living. There's lots of job opportunities within the community because the community creates specific jobs. So rabbis, teachers, Yiddish-speaking grocery shops, clothing shops for Hasidic, garments. But there's a lot of exploitation of the benefit system. So people usually, even people who earn money, will earn money in cash and not claim it so they can get the maximum benefit allowance. People will avoid paying taxes. People do all sorts of dirty tricks. For example, people will own a house but write it on someone else's name so they can get housing benefits for living in their own house. The BBC has done a podcast about it several months ago. I'll send a link for anyone who wants. It's called The Unorthodox Story of Miriam. So this is a woman who left the community around the same time that I did, and she bought a house with her own money, but her husband convinced her to write the house on his rich brother's name so that they can claim housing benefits. And now she left the community and the house is on her brother-in-law's name, and he didn't want to return it to her. And she had to drag it to court, where the court found that was indeed the case. It was her house. So the court found a case of this fraud, and it brought a lot of exposure to this. There's special organizations in Stamford Hill that advise people on how to maximize, benefit fraud and without being caught and things like that, which is very shameful. There are also some people who are in business and real estate. There's some rich individuals, and one thing to say in favor of the community, it's very charity focused. So the rich will help the poor. So yes, there's lots of poverty, but the few rich will almost in a socialist sense give most of the earnings for charity and help the poor. And there's several that really, in terms of community and support, the community is really superb. And it built this system where if you are one of them, if you're inside, you'll always be supported. You'll never be homeless. People will help you. You'll never go hungry. People will help you. In fact, there are community organizations that just go to hospitals to meet fellow Jews and give them food and encouragement and spend time with them. And on Saturdays and the Sabbath, where they're not allowed to take public transport, they'll walk 1 or 2 hours to go to the hospital to meet people. The communities are very. I do want to spend a couple. I still have 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah.
I do want to spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about some positive things of the community, because I've said a lot of negative things, and communities are complex. No community is wholly evil or wholly good. And of course, I have left, so my perspective, it's easy for me to notice the critical bits, because those are what pushed me out. But if you'll talk with someone who's still in there, they'll point out lots of very nice and noble things within the community. I'll just mention a couple. So the community is very family-oriented. Families are big. And some of you may have different views on the size of families and so on, but what it does mean is that there's so much joy in the community. There's always something going on, and families are very, very close. So almost on a weekly basis, we'll have a wedding of a family member. There'll be a birth, a bar mitzvah. and it keeps people together. Men, for example, see each other 3 times a day in the synagogue. So you make very, very close-knit friendships that are very meaningful. Women engage in all kinds of charity initiatives together. And there really is a sense. It's not only a community that has shared values. It's a community that in the community you know everyone. Everyone knows each other, even though they're like something like 30,000-40,000 people living in the community I grew up in. People, if you might not know the individual, but you know their family, you know their sister, you know their brother, and people are willing to help each other. It also leads to there's also more gossip going around and tighter control. People, it's more difficult to express yourself creatively, or to any deviation will be noticed. For example, when I was 17 or 18, I walked into my synagogue on the Sabbath. It wasn't even the Sabbath. It wasn't the Sabbath. It was on a weekdays with a wristwatch. And there's no law against having wristwatches, but again, my community has rejected modernity to such an extent that the wristwatch is seen as something that's modern. A good Hasidic boy shouldn't wear a wristwatch. There's no law against it. That nobody would. But because the community is so tight knit, within minutes there was the rumor spread through the synagogue. Izzy Posen has a wristwatch, and just those
Like Twitter before Twitter, almost.
Right.
Public shaming, but by word of mouth.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's great. So we'll wrap it there for the first half. We'll take a break of 15 to 20 minutes. Please buy lots of drinks, and then we'll come back and I'll pass the mic into the audience and do Q&A.
Yeah.